build resilience into our organizations and ourselves in a fast-changing world? That's the subject of my ongoing research, and it's a set of topics which I'm going to share some provisional thoughts with you around today. In today's business world, there are a lot of narratives built on animal metaphors. So, for example, there are the unicorns. We all know what unicorns are. In terms of the business world, they are the fast-growing companies worth around $1 billion or more, at least in terms of what people say that they are worth. And of course, they're the kind of the heroes of the day. And then there are the dinosaurs. And I think we all know who the dinosaurs are. Those are those big established companies which are on the verge of extinction. And nobody wants to be a dinosaur, and yet if you believe the business narrative, the press of today, there's a lot of them out there. And here's an example. There's ample evidence that today's technologies will tear apart banking as we now know it and create an entirely new financial system. Kind of scary stuff if you are a traditional large bank like a Barclays Bank or a JP Morgan or whatever. And obviously if you're one of these unicorns, these fintech companies that is getting lots of funding and getting a lot of visibility, it's an exciting prospect. The kind of wrinkle in the story, though, is that that's a quote from 25 years ago, 26 years ago. And I have been going back in time over the decades, and I can take this all the way back to the 1960s. If you know anything about the world of financial services, at least since the 1960s, and quite honestly, probably a lot earlier, if you did the historical analysis, you can find people predicting that the banking system as we know it today is on the verge of extinction, or at least dramatic change. And of course, 1996, if you remember, that was the era of the first round of the internet revolution, when suddenly it became possible to do lots of things over the internet. And of course, the world has changed. There's no question that the internet revolution did change banking significantly. But did it tear apart banking as we now know it? Well, it didn't. You know, I'm of an age where I can remember back in the 1970s wandering down a high street in the UK, and there was Barclays Bank and Lloyds Bank and HSBC Bank, and then there was NatWest West Bank, exactly the same banks 45 years ago as we see today. So has banking been completely torn apart? Of course it's not. What's happened is lots of things have changed, but in fact an awful lot of things have stayed the same. And sometimes in this narrative of change, we kind of forget how much stability there is also in the world. So I decided to kind of get to grips with this. I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation here. A very simple thing. I want you to shout out a number. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a sort of a framing around what I want you to say. You take the Fortune 500. Okay, this is the biggest American companies in terms of revenues. And I did this analysis last year, so I'm looking at the 2020 data. And I said to myself, 25 years earlier, when the internet first came along in the early 90s, 25 years earlier, there was also a Fortune 500 list. And my question to you is, if you take the list from last year, how many of the companies on that list did not exist in any form at all in 1995, 25 years earlier? Shout some numbers out. How many of those companies did not exist in any form at all? Yeah. Exactly. And nobody knows, and if you do know, it's because you read the article I wrote on the subject. The answer is, well, I've had everything from 400 of the companies didn't exist to almost none of them. And it turns out that the true answer is almost none. The true answer is 17. So let's just understand what I'm saying. I mean, the 17 companies, you know the names of half of them off the top of your head. It is not Apple, it's Google, it is Facebook, it is Netflix, it's Tesla, it's Booking.com, it's Expedia. I mean, I can go on, but I'm not going to. You get the idea. The key point, though, is there are only 17 of these companies in the Fortune 500. The other 483 companies have been around in some shape or form, either for hundreds of years, or in other cases, maybe for 50, 60, 70 years. Companies which have figured out a way of adapting. So that number absolutely takes pretty much everybody by surprise. Most people guess somewhere in the range of 1 to 200. The true answer is very, very small. And so, of course, you've got to say to yourself, well, what's going on here? Why is it that we are overestimating dramatically the amount of change that's happening? And the short answer is lots of established companies are actually doing some pretty smart things in terms of adapting to new technologies. And so the classical way of thinking about it is along comes a fintech company or along comes digital streaming. And our job as an incumbent is to fight back, to deliberately kind of mimic what the startup company is doing to kind of run them out of business. It turns out that that is actually a relatively seldom used strategy. There's 3 other strategies which are actually more common. Think about our good friends at Disney. Streaming, online streaming, kicked off in about 2005 with YouTube. We saw Netflix, we saw Amazon movies in the 2007-8. For the next decade, Disney completely ignored streaming. What did they do instead? They bought companies. They bought Pixar, they bought Marvel, they bought Lucasfilms. They doubled down on their core business, which is basically creating really good movie content. So much more important than having a streaming business. And so, of course, they had huge power when selling to Netflix and Amazon and so forth. And it was only in 2015, when it became exactly clear to Disney how streaming was working, that they decided to make a play. And as we all know, Disney Plus is now a huge player. But that was very much only a 15-year later decision. So doubling down is a cool strategy, a sensible strategy. Another strategy that companies adopt is retrenchment, pulling back to some degree, finding a protected part of the market in which you can survive. If you know anything about W.H. Smith, the UK-based newsagents, you know that they used to be everywhere. They saw the internet coming. They realized they couldn't compete with the likes of Amazon. And so rather than doing that, they retrenched in their kind of core area, which basically means high traffic areas in airports, in train stations, on busy high streets, absolutely kind of figuring out ways to squeeze every last drop of spending out of us as individuals who go into the newsagents. And for 15 years straight, W.H. Smith saw its revenues, its top line go down, and its bottom line go up. They squeezed every last drop of juice out of a rather decaying business model, but a very, very smart strategy if you are, in fact, a shareholder in W.H. Smith, rather than seeing them doing something a little bit crazy. And then the third strategy is complete reinvention. You all know the name Fujifilm. 25 years ago, they were competing with Kodak. They were competing in, guess what? Making film and processing film. Hugely profitable business. Unlike Kodak, they were smart enough to say, we can see that the world of digital imaging is changing our industry beyond recognition. Fuji took its chemical business, and you'll love this, they decided to take those chemicals that they used to use in film and to move it into the world of cosmetics. Yep, from film to cosmetics, and then subsequently into pharmaceuticals. They actually have active drug manufacturing in the world of COVID. So Fujifilm is no longer a film company. They've reinvented themselves. So my point is very simple, that big companies are smarter than we give them credit for. They have figured out ways of adapting to a rapidly changing world. So they're not dinosaurs. And if we're just to stay with the animal metaphor, they are actually dancing elephants, elephants who have learned to dance. They have figured out that even though they are large, they will be able to adapt to the world far better, in fact, than most people would ever give them credit for. So that was part one of my thesis, and I've been talking to executives around the world about this. And I want to share a brief story. I was with a large professional services company, and I was talking to the group of senior partners in that consulting company. And I was explaining my results, and I was saying, look, the fact is, in the world of professional services, you talk a lot about disruption, but actually here's the evidence, here is what's going to happen, here is what's happened in the past, And in fact, I reckon you're almost immune from disruption, quite honestly. You have got so many things going for yourselves in terms of existing brand and clients and so forth, that you are not going to go bankrupt, and you aren't even going to lose any significant amount of your market share. And I thought they'd be pleased to hear that, because that's a kind of a good news story. They hated it. They absolutely hated it. They said, we buy your argument. We get it. We're happy for you to discuss that here, but do not tell our people. I don't want you telling all of those accountants and consultants around the world your story. And I think you know why. Because they were, of course, a little bit worried that my story would make everybody a little bit complacent. So as I thought about my findings, the bigger question that emerged was the following. Why is it that we insist on deluding ourselves about the risk of disruption, when the evidence says that, in fact, disruption, even though it's a thing, is far less common than we would like to give it credit for? And I've got a couple of explanations, and I'm just going to share them with you, and then I'm going to finish up with a few slightly more sort of at a personal level thoughts on what this means to us as individuals. We tell stories as executives. We still tell stories, first of all, to the outside world. If I'm running a big company, I want to persuade the world that we are a progressive company, that we're an innovative company, that we have our hands on all of the latest ideas and we are acting on them. These days, if you literally talk about having a blockchain strategy, the analysts sit up and take note and they give you credit for it. And to some extent, you don't even have to follow through on it. The fact that you're just talking about your blockchain strategy is enough to help them to think that you are moving in the right direction. So we tell stories to the outside world around how progressive we are. We also, of course, feel the need to tell a story to our employees. And we're really worried, particularly in large companies, we're really worried that this inertia is a really powerful force that is essentially causing everybody to kind of just get a little bit stuck on that hamster wheel of doing the same things year after year and not adapting. And so we almost feel like we've got to create this countervailing force, even if it's not true, to try to persuade people that they need to have a little bit of an eye on what's changing, to keep them a little bit more on their toes, to kind of G them up a little bit. And that was my professional services company's partners' attitude, was they wanted to make sure that their people were staying on their toes. And so that is a second story. And then the third story is actually the one that we tell to ourselves. And this isn't just executives of big companies. This is you and I as well. We like to convince ourselves that right now we are at that inflection point in history when suddenly everything's going exponential. And you hear that every time you hear a futurist talking, every time you read the business press on these sort of things, there is somebody trying to make the case that it's been very, very stable up until now, but just wait, it's about to go exponential. And if you think about it, that can't be right. You heard my earlier point about banking in 1995, predictions that banking was going to change. You go back through history, every generation, there is huge change underway. If you go back to the early parts of the 20th century, when electrification first came along, imagine a world where suddenly there are electric lights and there are vehicles on the roads. That is a far more dramatic change in how we live our lives than simply having access to a smartphone with lots of information on it. So my point is, we delude ourselves. This is a terrible conceit. We delude ourselves to believe that we happen to have been born at that point in time when everything is changing. And of course, that cannot be true. There's lots of things changing. There's lots of things staying the same. So we understand, I think, why it is that we kind of talk to ourselves about the need to believe that things are changing. What should we actually then do about it? And I want to draw on the work of the famous psychologist Daniel Kahneman. He's a name that is very familiar to many of you. In his most famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow, I will bet many of you have actually read, or at least read some of it. It's a very long book. Daniel Kahneman's thesis is very simple. The brain is a wonderful but complex thing. And there is the slightly more primitive part of the brain, which is the one, of course, that kind of our forebears had when they were in the savannah trying to avoid getting eaten by a lion or whatever. And that primitive part of the brain is very kind of quick acting, and it acts subconsciously. And very, very quickly, we either fight or we flight, we run away. That's part of the brain. And then there's the evolved part of the brain, the more sophisticated one, which has emerged over the last few thousand years. And that's the much more kind of rational, conscious, thoughtful part of our brain. And Daniel Kahneman's sort of thesis, if I'm kind of summing up in a rather trivial way, is that as thoughtful people, we should try to take stock. We should try to ensure that we don't let that hyper-emotional, subconscious brain override sensible, rational decisions. We have to listen to it, but we mustn't let it override what it is that we're really trying to do. And I think that way of thinking about ourselves as individuals actually applies very directly to the way that we run our organizations. In the following sense, you may have heard of the hype cycle. And the hype cycle basically suggests that every new technology gets hyped up, built up very, very quickly. And then at some point, there is a drop-off, because what happens, of course, is that the hype runs ahead of the actual technology. So there's a guy called Roy Amara. Amara's law, it says, essentially, we always overestimate the impact of technologies in the short run, but we underestimate their impact in the long run. And that is a way of saying what we see on the screen here, which is the hype cycle. And so if you are taking Daniel Kahneman's ideas seriously, and this is really what I'm seeing coming out of my research into companies, we see the smartest companies are the ones who are actually a little bit contrarian. They are deliberately almost pushing against the kind of the dominant logic that they see. So of course we want them to be sensitive to the weak signals. We want them to be, have their ear to the ground as new technologies, as new threats coming along. We need to be conscious of those things. But the key thing is not to get caught up in the hype, to actually deliberately take stock. I can think of many companies where they have thrown everything at these new technologies and got their fingers burned. I mentioned Disney earlier. Go back to the early 1990s. Rupert Murdoch, News Corporation, was one of the earliest investors in internet service providers in the early 90s. He also bought a company called MySpace, which was killed off by Facebook. Rupert Murdoch always wanted to be first, but sometimes being first costs you an absolute fortune. So there are as many damages or dangers of acting quickly as there are acting slowly. And in fact, if I then look at which companies have been the most successful through my research, it is the ones that have invested steadily through the trough. And if I'm thinking about companies like the New York Times, who've finally found a way of making the paywall work in news, I'm thinking of Roche, the pharmaceutical company, which has spent 25 years building its biotechnology business. I'm talking about Disney. There are many such cases of companies who have done that. And that, for me, is the right strategy. So I want to conclude with a couple of quick thoughts. And this is why I call my talk Leading Fast and Slow. When we are faced with potential disruption, it's very easy to think fast and to follow what everyone else is doing and to try to listen to what the analysts are saying and making changes in a scattergun way. For me, the smart money is actually to think slow, to take careful and deliberate action and to pace it sequentially over time. That seems to be the formula for success. So my advice back to the professional services company I mentioned earlier is I want you to be paranoid and pragmatic at the same time. There's a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald: the test of a first-rate intelligence is to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time and still have the capacity to function. That, for me, is what we need to do. We need to be both kind of paranoid that there's new technologies out there which might change things, but pragmatic and honest about the fact that they almost certainly will not actually kill us off. That, for me, is the lesson from my research. Thank you very much.